A child was born without arms. Then another. Then another. Doctors didn't understand why, until they started asking the mothers. Every single one of them had taken the same pill. One pill. Marketed as completely safe, available without a prescription. That pill was called thalidomide, and the company that made it was never convicted of a crime. Chemie Grünenthal, West Germany, 1954. The new compound was thalidomide. The early animal tests showed something that looked, on the surface, promising. You couldn't give adult mice a lethal dose no matter how much you administered. You could not kill them with it. Grünenthal took that result and called it safety. What they did not consider was the only question that would eventually matter. What would this compound do to a developing human fetus? They didn't test it on pregnant animals at any stage. In West Germany in the mid-1950s, there was no legal requirement to run those tests before putting a drug on the market. No regulatory authority demanded it. No law required it. No requirement. So they didn't run the test. And women were the ones who swallowed the cost. 1957. Thalidomide goes on the German market under the brand name Contergan. Marketed initially as a sedative and anti-anxiety medication. Then, crucially, for morning sickness in pregnant women. The advertising language was remarkable in its confidence. Non-toxic, completely safe, no habit-forming properties, safe even for children. One Grünenthal brochure specifically stated, "Can be given to pregnant women and nursing mothers without any fear of harm to mother or child." Doctors trusted the brochures. Pharmacists trusted the doctors. Patients trusted the pharmacists. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. Within 2 years, Contergan was one of the best-selling pharmaceutical products in West Germany. Grünenthal licensed the drug across country after country under local brand names. In Japan, the drug stayed on shelves for 10 more months after the German withdrawal. The distributor was slow to act. The authorities were slower. By 1961, 46 countries had approved some version of thalidomide for sale. 46. By 1961, thalidomide was in 46 countries. Then the maternity wards started answering back. But by 1961, there had already been years of internal warnings that Grünenthal had seen and suppressed. The first warning came from outside the company, a neurologist named Ralph Voss. 1959. He had been seeing patients with peripheral neuropathy, progressive nerve damage in the extremities, a burning, tingling sensation in the hands and feet that in some cases led to partial paralysis. He was methodical about tracing the cause. He went through his patients' histories. He looked at what they had in common. Contergan appeared in case after case. Voss wrote a formal letter to Grünenthal. Grünenthal sent a company representative to his office to explain his misunderstanding of the data. The meeting was cordial. The drug remained on the market. Voss began receiving similar reports from other neurologists across Germany. He compiled them. He sent another letter. He received another meeting. No withdrawal, no public warning, no investigation. Inside Grünenthal, a researcher named Wilhelm Kunze had been doing his own analysis of the compound's properties. He found evidence of neurotoxicity, evidence consistent with what Voss was seeing in his patients. He understood the significance of what he had found. He drafted a scientific paper. He reached out to a journal. When Grünenthal discovered he was attempting to publish, the company hired private investigators. They documented Kunze's movements. They tracked his contacts. They mapped the people he was speaking to inside and outside the company. They applied pressure to the scientific journal he was submitting to. His findings were suppressed for years. A company marketing its product as non-toxic hired investigators to track a scientist who had found it was toxic. This is not a reconstruction. This is documented in the criminal trial materials. The same trial that would run for 2 years and end without a single conviction. We'll get to that. By 1960, Grünenthal had received more than 1,000 reports of adverse effects from physicians across Germany. 1,000 reports. The executives knew. The internal response wasn't a withdrawal. It was a communications strategy. While all of this was happening in Germany, a pharmaceutical company called Richardson Morel was working to bring thalidomide to the United States. Their brand name for the product, Chemie. Richardson Morel had signed a licensing agreement with Grünenthal. They were confident in the drug. They had reason to be. It was one of the best-selling sedatives in Europe, with a safety profile described in glowing terms in all the available literature. In anticipation of FDA approval, they distributed more than 2 million thalidomide tablets to American physicians. For clinical trials, they said, before the drug was approved. They sent it out to hospitals, to private clinics, to OB/GYN practices. They wanted the drug in doctors' hands before approval, so that when approval came, the network was already in place. The formal application for FDA approval arrived in September 1960. Frances Kelsey had been at the FDA for exactly 1 month. She was 37 years old, a pharmacologist with a medical degree. She had done research on how drugs behaved during pregnancy, specifically, how some compounds that were harmless to adult animals could have severe effects on fetal development. She brought that background to her new job. The Chemie application was her first major case. She started reading. What she found were not obvious errors, not missing documents, not evidence of fraud. Gaps. Studies that raised questions rather than answered them. Animal data that stopped before reaching any conclusion about fetal exposure. No testing on pregnant animals at any stage. No data on whether thalidomide crossed the placental barrier, the membrane that separates the mother's circulation from the developing fetus. To Frances Kelsey, the absence of fetal exposure data was not a minor administrative gap. It was the central scientific question for a drug being marketed specifically to pregnant women for morning sickness. She sent the application back to Richardson Morel. More data required. Richardson Morel's response was not to generate the missing data. Their representatives contacted the FDA by telephone. They followed up by letter. Multiple letters, over multiple months. They characterized Kelsey's requests as petty, as nitpicking, as obstructive bureaucracy. Internal memos from Richardson Morel during this period, later obtained through public records requests, describe her as an unreasonable reviewer who was delaying a safe and effective medication. They went above her. They contacted her supervisors at the FDA. They requested that she be reassigned or that her objections be overruled by a more senior official. They called her a nitpicker. She went back to reading the files. During those 14 months, Kelsey was also tracking developments in European medical literature. She noticed reports emerging from Germany about neurological side effects. She flagged these to Richardson Morel, asking how they had investigated and addressed these concerns. The company responded that the neurological reports were isolated and that Kelsey was over-interpreting limited data. She sent the application back again. 6 times over 14 months, Richardson-Morel submitted new or supplementary materials. 6 times, Kelsey reviewed the submission and returned it. The data is not sufficient. I will not sign this. Each submission was more voluminous than the last. Each came with cover letters from Richardson-Morel that grew more frustrated in tone. Each arrived with the implicit message, "You are the only obstacle between this drug and the American market." She was not moved. In November 1961, a doctor in Sydney, Australia, named William McBride, started seeing the same rare deformity again and again, enough times to know it was no coincidence. He began documenting the cases systematically. He traced the mothers. He went through their medical histories. He looked for the common factor. It was thalidomide. Every affected mother had taken it during the first trimester. McBride hesitated. What if it was coincidence? What if he published and damaged a drug that was helping millions of pregnant women worldwide? What if his sample was too small? He sent one paragraph to The Lancet, November 1961. At almost the same moment, a German pediatrician named Widukind Linz had been building the same pattern independently from case reports across West German hospitals. He contacted Grünenthal directly. He told them he had evidence that Contergan was causing the deformities he was documenting. He told them the pattern was clear. He asked them to withdraw the drug from the market voluntarily. Grünenthal did not withdraw. Linz went to a German newspaper. He shared what he had found. The story was about to publish. Only then, facing a front page they could not contain, did Grünenthal pull Contergan from the German market. November 26, 1961. Not a decision made on scientific evidence, a retreat made under the pressure of exposure. The drug was withdrawn across most of the 46 countries within weeks of the German withdrawal. By the time the drug was fully off global markets, the damage was done. 10,000 children. That is the figure used by the Thalidomide Trust, the organization founded by and for survivors. 10,000 children born with severe limb deformities caused by thalidomide exposure during gestation. About the number, historians debate. About the catastrophe, there is no debate. And in the United States? 17 cases. 17. All traced to the tablets Richardson-Morel had distributed to physicians before approval was ever granted. The clinical trial tablets that were already in circulation across American medical practices. Not 0, but 17 against 10,000. Because of one woman who kept sending the application back. Because of one woman they called a nitpicker. Kennedy awarded Kelsey the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service in 1962, the highest civilian honor available to a federal employee. The company that had called her a nitpicker did not comment publicly. And what happened to Grünenthal? 1968, 7 years after withdrawal. Criminal proceedings opened in West Germany. 9 Grünenthal executives were charged. The charges? Negligent bodily harm, causing infant deaths, issuing misleading advertising claims, failing to disclose adverse effect reports from physicians. The indictment ran to more than 900 pages. The trial began with extensive press coverage and public attention. Survivors and their families came to give testimony. The internal communications that had been seized from Grünenthal's offices were entered into the record. The letters suppressing Kuntz's research, the thousands of adverse effect reports, the internal discussions about how to manage the volume of complaints coming in. The trial ran for 2 years. In 1970, it was terminated. No convictions. The reason given by the court? The case had become too legally and scientifically complex to resolve within a reasonable time frame. Continuing the proceedings was not in the public interest. Not in the public interest. 9 men walked out of that courtroom in 1970. No prison, no criminal record, no formal accounting of the private investigators, of the suppressed research, of the letters that characterized a documented pattern of harm as a misunderstanding of the data. None of that was in any final verdict, because there was no final verdict. The civil settlement that same year, divided among approximately 2,800 German survivors, worked out to roughly $8,000 per person at 1970 exchange rates. For a lifetime. For a body shaped by a drug no one warned them about. Survivors were required to sign away all future legal claims against Grünenthal as a condition of receiving the settlement. No more. Never again. In Britain, survivors spent decades fighting for what German survivors had negotiated. The Sunday Times launched a detailed investigation into Distillers Company, the British distributor. Distillers went to court. The British government granted an injunction blocking publication of the newspaper's findings. The injunction stood for 8 years. The European Court of Human Rights lifted it in 1979, ruling it a violation of freedom of expression. 8 years of silence, enforced by the state. The word companies and courts used most often for the people who kept filing claims and wouldn't accept settlements? Difficult. In 2012, 50 years after the withdrawal, the CEO of Chemie Grünenthal stood before an audience of survivors and their families and said the word, sorry. He said, "We ask for forgiveness." Some survivors walked out. Some had waited 50 years for that word. Some said the word changed nothing about the reality of their bodies, about the surgeries, about the years of navigating a world not built for the way they were shaped. Some of the people who had fought hardest to hear it were already gone. Frances Kelsey died in 2015. She was 101 years old. She did not save America through some act of extraordinary personal courage. She had no platform, no political allies, no power beyond one narrow professional function. Review the application, determine if the data meets the required standard. She determined the data did not meet the standard. 6 times, 14 months, under sustained, documented institutional pressure from a company that was lobbying to have her removed from the case. She did not approve. That is why the number is 17 and not 10,000. 1 signature withheld. They called her a nitpicker. That's why America was safe. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. 399 men believed they were being treated. The government knew the truth. It knew for 40 years. and it said nothing. That's the next story.